Jackson County Sheriff's Department. How can I help you, please?
Yes, ma'am. I need to report my daughter missing.
Is she missing or did she run away?
No, she's missing.
And what was she wearing?
She has on a light blue coat, black pants, and white stripes.
Okay.
On the morning of January 30th, 2005, an Indiana State Police trooper was driving near Cypress Lake. It was a wooded area just off Interstate 65, roughly 15 miles from the small town of Crothersville. Something blue near the water caught his attention. He stopped. He walked closer. 5 days earlier, a 10-year-old girl had left her home to buy toilet paper. She was supposed to be gone for 30 minutes. She had walked that route before. She knew the area. Her parents believed the town was safe. By the time the trooper made that discovery near the creek, helicopters had already searched the skies. Tracking dogs had traced a scent to railroad tracks and then lost it. An Amber Alert had been issued. Volunteers had combed through fields, yards, and playgrounds. Crothersville had not seen a homicide in 25 years. Now the first Amber Alert fatality in Indiana's history was unfolding in that quiet community. How does a child disappear from a town of 1,500 people? How does a search involving more than 100 neighbors end miles away in a wooded area? And why would a man confess to the crime, only for investigators to later discover his DNA was not even present? In this video, I will share 9 unbelievable facts that make this case truly disturbing. Welcome back to Dark Case Storytime. We bring you new true crime documentaries every single week, so make sure you are subscribed and all notifications are turned on. And now let's get straight into today's video. On January 25th, 2005, Katie Collman started her day like any other. She lived in Crothersville, Indiana, with her mother Angie and her father John Neese. Katie was a 4th grade student at Crothersville Elementary School. That afternoon, she returned home from school around 3 p.m. Angie was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Katie volunteered to help by walking to the nearby dollar store to buy toilet paper. The store was only a short distance away, roughly 1.5 blocks to 3 blocks depending on the route. Katie had made the trip before. She left the house at approximately 3:15 p.m. A store employee later confirmed she made the purchase. Several witnesses reported seeing her walking home around 4 p.m. near the railroad tracks. One neighbor later told the family that Katie had stopped by to inform them that their dog had been killed near those same tracks. That was the last confirmed sighting. When Katie did not return home, Angie initially believed she may have stopped to talk with friends. Katie had several friends along the route. Angie began calling those homes. No one had seen her. As the hours passed, concern replaced assumption. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Angie contacted police to report her daughter missing. News traveled quickly. Around 125 local volunteers joined the search that night. Police searched yards, playgrounds, tracks, and surrounding areas. Tracking dogs were deployed. They followed Katie's scent to the railroad tracks, then the trail stopped. Procedurally, when a scent trail ends abruptly, investigators consider several possibilities. The subject may have entered a vehicle, the scent may have been contaminated, or environmental conditions may have interfered. Helicopters scanned from above. Search teams continued through the night. Initially, an Amber Alert was not issued because the case did not meet the specific criteria for confirmed abduction. That requirement would later become significant. On January 27th, after new witness information emerged, the Amber Alert was activated. Posters described Katie as 4 feet 6 inches tall with chin-length brown hair and brown eyes. She had a lazy eye. She had last been seen wearing a red shirt, black sweatpants with a stripe, black tennis shoes, and a light blue winter coat. The description of a suspect vehicle soon followed. A witness reported seeing Katie inside a white Ford F-150 pickup truck shortly after her disappearance. The driver was described as a very thin white male, approximately 18 to 20 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. The truck was described as a late 1980s or early 1990s model that appeared clean and well-maintained. Investigators now faced a difficult task. The Ford F-150 was a common vehicle in southern Indiana. Without a plate number or distinctive marking, narrowing the list would require time. Time, however, was already passing. In small communities, searches often rely on familiarity. Neighbors know one another. Vehicles are recognizable. Yet no one could immediately identify the truck described by the witness. As the days progressed, the search expanded outward. Law enforcement reconstructed Katie's route repeatedly. They interviewed residents. They collected tips. The FBI became involved once abduction was suspected. Each new hour reduced the likelihood of a simple explanation. By the morning of January 30th, 5 days after Katie left for the store, the search had shifted from rescue to recovery. The question investigators now faced was no longer where is she? It was who had taken her. On January 30th, 2005, an Indiana State Police trooper discovered Katie's body in a creek near Cypress Lake. The location was roughly 15 miles north of Crothersville, near Interstate 65. Her hands were bound behind her back. An autopsy later determined that she had been sexually assaulted and drowned. The search that had consumed Crothersville for 5 days had ended. Now the investigation shifted fully into homicide. This marked the first time since Indiana's Amber Alert system began in 2003 that a missing child subject to an alert had been found deceased. The emotional weight of that fact was immediate. Parents in town began keeping their children indoors. Residents who once described Crothersville as untouched by serious crime began reassessing that belief. Investigators moved quickly to identify suspects. Within days, a 20-year-old local man named Charles "Chucky" Hickman came forward. Hickman lived just yards from the dollar store Katie had visited. Neighbors described him as someone who often stood in his yard staring into space and who hosted frequent gatherings at his residence. Hickman contacted police and confessed involvement in Katie's death. He told investigators that Katie had witnessed methamphetamine activity near the railroad tracks. According to Hickman, he and another man, Timothy O'Sullivan, abducted her to prevent her from speaking about what she had seen. He claimed they took her to his trailer and later transported her to the creek. He stated that she accidentally fell into the water and drowned. For a brief period, the case appeared resolved. A confession had been obtained. A narrative had formed. National media outlets began covering the story, focusing heavily on the alleged methamphetamine connection. Outlets including CNN and the New York Times reported on the case. The small town of Crothersville found itself at the center of international attention. Yet investigators noticed inconsistencies in Hickman's statements. Details shifted between interviews. Certain aspects of the timeline did not align with known facts. Procedurally, when a suspect's confession changes over time, investigators must test its reliability against physical evidence. A confession alone is not considered conclusive. Police collected forensic samples from Katie's body and from items recovered at the scene. Among the evidence was a cigarette butt located near where her body had been found. Laboratory testing began. The results created a turning point. The DNA recovered from Katie's body did not match Charles Hickman. It also did not match Timothy O'Sullivan. The cigarette butt yielded the same unidentified DNA profile. At that moment, the investigation split in two directions. If Hickman's confession was false, then why confess? If the DNA belonged to someone else, then who was that person? Investigators now faced the possibility that the individual who admitted involvement was not the primary offender. The methamphetamine narrative that had drawn national media attention began to weaken. Prosecutors would later dismiss the charges against Hickman. The confession was determined to be unreliable. With Hickman no longer the focus, investigators returned to the physical evidence. The cigarette butt became central. It carried the same DNA profile found on Katie's body. Unlike eyewitness testimony, DNA does not change its story. The question now was how to identify the individual connected to that sample. One detail stood out. The cigarette brand recovered near the creek was uncommon in the local area. Investigators contacted 4 retailers within approximately 60 kilometers who sold that brand. Each was asked to notify authorities if anyone purchased it. This approach shifted the investigation from reacting to tips to actively monitoring behavior. Meanwhile, the description of the white Ford F-150 remained active. Investigators had previously interviewed multiple owners of similar trucks, including a man from Seymour named Anthony Ray Stockelman. At the time, he had denied involvement. He had stated that he had seen a girl walking, but nothing more. Now, with a DNA profile in hand and a rare cigarette brand identified, investigators were waiting for a link. The break came when a store clerk contacted police. A man had recently purchased that unusual cigarette brand. He was driving a white pickup truck. The vehicle matched the earlier witness description. The registration traced back to Anthony Ray Stockelman. The focus of the investigation shifted once again. If the DNA from the cigarette matched the DNA from Katie's body, and if that DNA matched Stockelman, then the earlier interview had taken on new significance. Investigators prepared to speak with him again. When investigators returned to Anthony Ray Stockelman, they were no longer conducting a routine interview. They were testing a forensic lead. Stockelman was asked to provide a DNA sample. He complied. The laboratory comparison produced a match. The DNA profile taken from Katie's body matched Stockelman. The DNA profile recovered from the cigarette butt near the creek also matched Stockelman. According to prosecutors, the probability of another individual sharing that same DNA profile was effectively negligible. The cigarette butt had become the pivot point in the case. Investigators then examined additional physical evidence. Red carpet fibers recovered from Katie's clothing were compared to carpeting inside a residence belonging to Stockelman's mother. The fibers were determined to be consistent. Stockelman had been helping his mother move on the day Katie disappeared. Her home was located along the general path Katie would have taken while walking back from the store. That placement became significant. The earlier confession from Charles Hickman was now weighed against physical evidence. DNA from the rope used to bind Katie's hands did not match Hickman. It matched Stockelman. The timeline Hickman described did not align with verified witness sightings. Investigators determined Hickman's confession did not match the forensic findings. Murder charges against Hickman were dismissed. The methamphetamine narrative that had drawn national attention was formally discounted. The case returned to the evidence. On April 6, 2005, Stockelman was arrested and charged with molestation. On May 19th, the charge was upgraded to murder. Jackson County Prosecutor Stephen Pearson announced that he would seek the death penalty, citing Katie's age as the aggravating circumstance. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors outlined the strength of the forensic evidence. The DNA connected Stockelman to both the body and the cigarette at the scene. The carpet fibers linked the interior of his mother's home to Katie's clothing. A witness had described a white Ford pickup truck matching his vehicle. Procedurally, cases built primarily on forensic evidence are structured differently from cases based on confession. Each element must independently support the others. In this case, the DNA evidence served as the central pillar. The cigarette brand had been uncommon enough to narrow surveillance to only 4 retailers. A store clerk's call had placed Stockelman purchasing that brand while driving a white truck. That sequence, cigarette, store, truck, DNA, created a closed evidentiary loop. Facing the possibility of capital punishment, Stockleman entered into a plea agreement with the state. He agreed to plead guilty to murder and child molesting. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to remove the death penalty from consideration and dismiss a confinement charge. Sentencing would be determined by the judge. In court, as Stockleman was being led away, his wife Tabitha shouted, "Why'd you do it, Tony?" The plea ended the need for a jury trial. It also prevented the detailed presentation of evidence that would have occurred during a full capital proceeding. For some residents of Crothersville, that decision brought relief. For others, it brought frustration. On April 17, 2005, Anthony Ray Stockleman stood before a judge for sentencing. Under the plea agreement, the death penalty was no longer on the table. The court would determine the final sentence. Prosecutor Stephen Pearson stated that life without parole would be a just and appropriate outcome. Stockleman had pleaded guilty to murder and child molesting. The aggravating circumstance cited by the state was Katie's age. During the sentencing phase, Stockleman's defense presented mitigating arguments. He claimed he had no significant criminal history beyond 2 misdemeanor convictions. He argued that he had been suffering from emotional distress following the death of his father 6 months earlier. Witnesses testified that he had been close to his father and had cared for him during a lengthy illness. The court considered those arguments. It ultimately determined that the aggravating factor outweighed the proposed mitigators. Stockleman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for murder. He received an additional 30 years for child molesting. He later appealed the severity of the sentence. The Indiana Supreme Court affirmed the trial court's decision on June 20, 2007. The life sentence remained in place. Stockleman was transferred to the Wabash Valley Correctional Facility in Sullivan County, Indiana. There, another development unfolded. Jared Harris, Katie's cousin, was also incarcerated at the same facility on a burglary conviction. On September 19, 2006, Harris was transferred to the same wing as Stockleman. According to court records, Harris had made threats towards Stockleman prior to what happened next. On September 22, 2006, Harris entered the open cell that Stockleman shared with another inmate. He waited inside. When Stockleman returned to the cell, Harris closed the locking door behind them. An affidavit later stated that Harris restrained Stockleman and gave him a choice. According to Stockleman's statement, Harris told him, "I'm either gonna stick you and leave you bleeding, or I'm gonna tattoo you." Harris used a makeshift tattoo device to mark Stockleman's forehead. The words, "Katie's Revenge," were tattooed across it. Afterward, Harris discarded the device in a prison trash can. Prison officials placed Stockleman in protective custody following the incident. Harris was charged with battery. 2 correctional officers were later dismissed for making unauthorized copies of a photograph documenting the tattoo. The image circulated beyond the facility. For some residents of Crothersville, the tattoo represented a form of vigilante justice. For others, it was another reminder of how far the case had reached. Stockleman remains incarcerated under a life without parole sentence. Harris was later scheduled for release in January 2017. The investigation that began with a missing child in a town of 1,500 people ended with a forensic match, a guilty plea, and a life sentence. It also demonstrated how quickly a confession can misdirect an investigation, and how a single piece of physical evidence, a cigarette left near a creek, can determine the outcome of a case. Crothersville had not seen a homicide in 25 years before January 2005. The events of those 5 days changed that history. Katie left home for an errand that should have taken 30 minutes. The search lasted 5 days. The consequences lasted far longer.